The file was thin.
Vel'Shaan had reviewed thousands of personnel files in his career. Colleagues, specialists, junior technicians fresh from survey academies with their credentials layered like geological strata, each certification a clean stratum above the last. He knew within 4 lines whether a file represented someone useful. Constance Muriel Okafor's file he finished in 2. 30 years of classroom instruction, regional fieldwork in coastal erosion documentation, a teaching qualification from a Lagos institution he had to search to locate on the regional registry. The phrase, keen observational instincts, appeared in her recommendation letter, written by someone whose own credentials suggested they had spent most of their career indoors. There was a photograph, a woman of 67 years, dark-skinned, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, and the expression of someone who had recently said something sensible that no one had listened to. Vel'Shaan approved her berth assignment, noted her dietary restrictions in the expedition log, and returned to his pre-departure calculations. The margin of his log sat empty at the bottom of each page. He had opened it out of habit when he began Constance's file. The margin was where he placed items of uncertain relevance, things that might matter later and might not. He closed it again. There was nothing to note. He had mapped 44 systems. His error margin across 3 decades of survey work with the Interplanetary Survey Corps was functionally 0. Not symbolically 0. Actually 0 in any unit of measurement the Corps used. He was not proud of this in a way he felt the need to announce. He was proud of it the way a structural engineer is proud of a bridge that hasn't fallen. The pride was in the fact, and the fact spoke. Verath 7 was a routine assignment. Geologically young, atmospherically thin, catalogued 6 years ago by an automated probe that had flagged it as terrestrial and moved on. 3 weeks of ground survey, standard instrumentation, a final mapped report submitted to the Corps archive. He had done this 44 times. He expected to do it 44 more before he retired. He did not expect to have his understanding of the word observation revised. He did not expect to open the margin at all. Verath 7 from low orbit was the gray-brown of old bone, a young world still in the process of deciding what it was, its surface creased with formations that hadn't yet committed to being mountains or plains, its atmosphere thin enough that the horizon curved with unusual clarity. Vel'Shaan stood at the crawler's forward viewport as they descended and felt the particular, familiar satisfaction of a place not yet mapped. A blank he was about to fill. Constance Muriel Okafor was standing behind him, also looking out the viewport. She had her old camera in one hand, a physical handheld device that still used light-sensitive film, which he had noted with mild professional puzzlement in the equipment manifest. She wasn't photographing the approach. She was just looking. After a long moment, she said, "It looks like it has secrets." Vel'Shaan said nothing. He returned to the descent calculations. His outer 2 fingers, the semi-prehensile ones, rested flat and still against his palms. Everything was as expected. On the first day, she asked him to stop the crawler. He had been expecting this in the abstract. The cultural liaison requiring adjustments, minor inefficiencies in the expedition schedule, polite accommodations. He had built a 15% time buffer into the 3-week plan. He stopped the crawler. What he had not built a buffer for was the specific activity of watching a 67-year-old human woman climb out of a survey vehicle, walk 30 meters to an unremarkable rock outcropping, crouch down, pick up a stone, and smell it. His instruments had cataloged that outcropping in 0.3 seconds. Mineral composition, age estimate, fracture patterns consistent with standard thermal cycling, nothing anomalous. He had the data on his secondary display before Constance had finished standing up. He watched her turn the stone over in her hands. He watched her bring it close to her face. He watched her smell it. which was a sensory approach to geological survey he had not previously encountered in 31 years of fieldwork. She turned it over again. She looked at the ground around the outcropping. She stood up slowly, with the deliberate care of someone whose knees had formed an opinion about crouching, and she said, "Something pushed through here. Recently. The break pattern's wrong for weathering." His secondary eyes flickered. Involuntary. A brief, lateral oscillation he disliked because he had no control over it. He attributed it to the quality of Verath 7's light, which had an unusual shortwave component the survey notes had mentioned. His instruments had detected nothing unusual. The break pattern was consistent with standard thermal cycling. He had the data. He noted her observation in the margin. That was what the margin was for. "Thank you," he said, because he was not unkind. "We'll continue." She wrote something in her own notebook before getting back in the crawler. He noticed. He did not ask. The margin began to fill across the following days in the patient, accumulative way that slow disasters do. Each entry small, each one individually dismissible, the total weight not apparent until later. Day 3. Constance asked him to stop again. The atmospheric sensors showed nothing unusual. Pressure consistent, no anomalous readings. The thin chemistry of Verath 7 doing exactly what the probes had predicted. Constance stood outside the crawler in the wind with her eyes closed and her face turned slightly upward, the way a person does when they are trying to hear something just below the threshold of certainty. Yis, his junior technician, watched from the crawler window with an expression of open curiosity that Vel'Shaan found mildly irritating. He waited. "There's a second weather system underneath the first one," Constance said. "Something's generating heat from below. The wind is arguing with itself." His instruments found nothing. He noted it in the margin. He found that evening that his jaw plate had been emitting a very low vibration for several hours, a frequency he felt in the bones of his own skull rather than heard, the Aethori equivalent of a persistent unease. He attributed it to the irregular sleep cycle of planetary survey work. He was, in this particular attribution, not being honest with himself. Day 7. She described an asymmetry in the valley floor. The instruments measured it and found the slope variance within normal parameters. She said the ground was shrugging. He did not know what this meant precisely, but he wrote it down because he had been writing things down, and the act of writing seemed to require that he continue. Day 9. She said she could smell something that didn't fit. He had no instrument for smell. He noted, olfactory anomaly, C. Okafor, characterizes environment as too alive for a dead world. He read this back to himself and felt his outer fingers extend very slightly away from his palms. By the end of the first week, something had happened to the expedition's social geography that Vel'Shaan had not planned for. Yis was eating meals with Constance. Not occasionally, consistently, with apparent enthusiasm, asking questions in the eager way of a young technician who had realized that something interesting was happening and wanted to understand it before she had to. Vel'Shaan ate at his workstation. He told himself this was because he had recalibration work to complete, which was true. He told himself the other thing was nothing, which was less true. He heard Constance one evening explaining to Yis a teaching method she had used for 30 years. She called it teaching students to argue with the map. She told Yis that the first thing she made her students do with any new landscape was find something that was wrong. Not wrong in a measurable sense, but wrong in the sense that it didn't fit the feeling of everything else. She said you had to find the wrongness before you could name it, or the naming would get in the way. Vel'Shaan, at his workstation across the room, experienced something he identified as irritation. He recalibrated the sensor array twice, which it did not require. On day 11, he did something he had not done since early in his career. He asked her a question. He had been thinking about the valley asymmetry, specifically about the observation he had noted as the ground shrugging, which was, by any rigorous standard, not a methodology. He needed to understand what she meant. Not because he thought she was right, because it was in his log, and things in his log required explanation. He found her in the forward cabin, instant coffee made in the small ceramic cup she had brought from home, notebook open. He sat down across from her and asked her to explain the valley observation in more precise terms. She looked at him with the patient expression of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms where precision was frequently requested and rarely the point. She talked about the valley. She described the way slope angle on the eastern face didn't match the western face in a way that erosion patterns could account for, not if the two faces had experienced the same geological events. She described this using the phrase, "The ground changed its mind halfway through." She said the cake layers, and here she must have seen something in his expression because she paused and said, "The strata, I mean, weren't sitting the way they should if the valley formed from above." She said it felt more like something had come from below and the surface had adjusted to accommodate it. He asked her to clarify her methodology, specifically what instrument or process she was applying. She thought about this with evident seriousness. Then she said, "Mr. Vel, I'm not being imprecise. I'm being accurate in a different language." His breathing inverted. He felt it as a heaviness in his chest, the 4-count exhale, the short intake, his body arriving at a conclusion his mind was still resisting. He stood up, intending to end the conversation at a natural point, and realized he was standing slightly earlier than he had planned to. She did not seem to notice. She poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table in front of the empty chair, as if he might come back, or as if it was simply the thing to do. He did not come back. That evening, in his bunk, he searched the etymological archive for the word observation. He had used it in some form in almost every report he had ever filed. He had apparently never examined it. The word was old, in multiple languages, and its oldest meanings were almost all physical. To watch over, to stand near, to keep, not to measure, not to record, to stand near. He closed the archive and lay in the dark and listened to the very faint hum in his jaw plate, and did not sleep for some time. Dr. Perrine Sol submitted her midpoint atmospheric analysis on day 14. It was thorough, precise, and confirmed everything the instruments had predicted. No second weather system, no anomalous thermal gradients. The atmospheric conditions of Varath 7 were exactly what an automated probe cataloged 6 years ago had suggested they would be. At the bottom of the report, in a footnote, she had written, "Observational notes submitted by Cultural Liaison C. Okafor have been reviewed and noted for archival purposes. No scientific corroboration found." Vel'Shaan read the report twice. He felt the particular relief of a prediction confirmed, an instrument trusted, a professional consensus holding. He looked at his reflection in the viewport glass, expecting to see the pale silver gray of his integument untroubled, the circulatory lines faint and receded, his body returning to baseline. They were not faint. The dark branching lines beneath his skin were, if anything, more pronounced than they had been that morning. He was not relieved. His body was announcing this with considerable clarity. He took a walk. This was unusual. He was not by nature a person who solved cognitive problems by moving through space, but the crawler felt small in a way it hadn't at the start of the expedition, and Varath 7's atmosphere, while thin, was breathable enough for a short excursion. He walked north along the edge of the third valley. He found Constance sitting on a low, flat rock at the valley's rim, her camera in her hands, looking west at the horizon. The light at that hour was doing something complicated with the atmospheric haze, a layering of amber and deep violet that his instruments would have quantified perfectly and that he found himself simply standing in for a moment. She didn't turn around. She didn't say anything. He stood beside her for perhaps 4 minutes. He did not speak either. Eventually, he went back inside. He had not looked at what she was photographing, but later, thinking about it, He realized she hadn't been photographing the valley. She had been photographing where the valley ended, the edge, the border, the place where rock became sky. He had noticed this without knowing why he noticed it, and he filed it where he filed things he didn't yet have a place for, in the margin. Day 16 came with no warning, which is, of course, how Day 16 always comes. The deep scan array had been running a third-pass recalibration, standard procedure at the survey's midpoint, not a response to anything unusual, simply the systematic care that produced error margins of functionally 0. The calibration completed at 0640 planetary time. At 0641, the geological model that Vel'Shaan had been building for 16 days developed a problem. Not a small problem. Not an anomalous reading requiring investigation. The ground survey model, the one that matched every instrument reading and every atmospheric scan and every data point he had collected with the precision of 31 years of methodology, was wrong. The surface of Verath 7 was not the geological story he had been mapping. It was a skin, a thin, geologically young surface underlaid by a system of thermal vents so vast and so active that the deep scan array, now correctly calibrated for a geological age estimate that turned out to have been off by a significant factor, lit them up across the entire primary display like a circulatory system made suddenly visible. Vel'Shaan sat in front of this display for a long time. Then he opened his margin notes. He read through them in order. He read them slowly, the way you read something when you already know where it is going but need to arrive at the destination honestly. The brake pattern wrong for weathering. The second weather system, the heat from below, the wind arguing with itself. The asymmetry in the valley floor, the ground that changed its mind. The smell of something too alive for a dead world. In 16 days, working without instruments, using a vocabulary that included the phrase cake layers, a 67-year-old retired geography teacher from Lagos had mapped a thermal vent system she had no technical means to detect. She had read the surface of an alien world the way she had taught children to read landscapes for 30 years. By finding the wrongness first. By trusting the thing that didn't fit before she could name what it was. He had been looking for the right answer in the right place and finding it precisely and completely and correctly. And he had been wrong. Not about the data, about what the data was telling him. He had mapped the skin and called it the body. Constance had been standing beside him for 16 days pointing at the body, and he had been noting it in the margin. His surface temperature dropped. Not the slight variation of a cool morning, a genuine cold flush, moving from his outer integument inward, the response his body produced when it encountered something genuinely, arrestingly beautiful. He had experienced this 11 times, 12 now, and he was not looking at a map. He was looking at a notebook that did not belong to him. He found this profoundly disorienting in a way that was, he recognized slowly, entirely appropriate. He went to find her. She was in the small galley having lunch, a flatbread she had brought from home, some preserved fruit, the inevitable coffee. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment that was slightly longer than he intended. "You were right," he said, "about all of it." She looked at him with an expression that was not surprised. She said, "I know. I was waiting for the planet to say so." He didn't know what to do with that. He sat down. She poured him a coffee without asking. He accepted it. It was, he noted, better than the ship's dispenser. He did not say so. He suspected she already knew. The conversation that followed, the real one, the long one, happened in pieces over 2 evenings while Yis and Perrine ran the recalibration scans. Vel'Shaan asked her, carefully, choosing his words with the same precision he brought to cartographic notation, how she did what she did. How she read the planet correctly for 16 days without a single instrument. Constance thought about this for a long time before answering. This was something he had noticed about her. She did not speak to fill space. She spoke when she had determined that what she was going to say was worth saying. She told him about teaching, about the early years when she had brought her students outside for geography lessons and discovered that what they were best at, before they knew anything, was finding what was wrong. A child looking at a landscape for the first time doesn't see what it is. They see what it should be and isn't. The wrongness comes first. The explanation comes later, and the explanation is often the less interesting part. She told him that 30 years of watching children encounter landscapes had rebuilt something in her own perception. She had learned to hold the naive view alongside the informed view, to let the wrongness of a thing surface before she reached for the vocabulary to explain it. She said, "I always told them, if something feels like it's hiding, it probably is. You just have to be willing to look before you know what you're looking for." Vel'Shaan's outer fingers were flat against his palms. He realized this without directing them. They had settled there on their own while he was listening. His secondary eyes were still. His jaw plate was quiet. He noted, with the clinical part of himself that never entirely stopped observing, that this was the most cognitively comfortable he had been since the expedition began. Nothing had been resolved. The survey model was still being rebuilt. He had more work ahead of him than he had anticipated. He was at ease. This was genuinely strange. He asked her what it felt like when she found the thing that didn't fit. She smiled. A broad, unhurried smile, the kind that suggested she had been waiting for someone to ask this for quite some time. She said, "Like a cold feeling, like something beautiful just said hello." He was very still for a moment. Then he described, for the first time he could remember describing it to anyone, the integument temperature drop, the cold flush, the response he had experienced 11 times in his career, always looking at a completed map. He said it was the closest thing to awe that his biology produced. She nodded as if he had confirmed something she suspected. She said, "That's what I feel when I find the thing that doesn't fit." He sat with this. Two people, opposite ends of the methodological spectrum, the same cold feeling, arriving there from entirely different directions, by entirely different roads, at the same moment of recognition. He had spent 31 years believing that the cold flush was the reward for precision. He was beginning to understand it was the reward for truth, regardless of how you arrived there. He began making his own margin notes that evening. Not instrument data. He had more than enough of that. He noted the quality of the light in the third valley at the 4th hour past planetary noon, which had a warmth his sensors recorded as a wavelength and which he found himself wanting to record as something more. He noted the sound the wind made through a particular rock formation on the eastern face, which his audio sensors captured as frequency data and which sounded, if he was being accurate in a different language, like something asking a question. He did not show these to anyone. He was not yet sure they were science. He was not yet sure that mattered. Dr. Perrine Sol revised her atmospheric report on day 19. She had gone back through the data, all of it from the beginning, the way you go back through evidence when you realize the verdict was wrong. The second weather system that Constance had identified on day 3 was there. It had been masked by instrument calibration assumptions layered on top of instrument calibration assumptions layered on top of a geological age estimate that was, it turned out, significantly incorrect. The heat signature was faint, but it was there, and it was consistent with the thermal vent network that the deep scan array had now fully mapped. It had been there on day 3. The instruments had not been wrong. They had been certain. Certainty, Vel'Shaan was learning, was its own kind of blindness. Perrine walked into the main survey room, set the revised report on the table in front of Constance, and looked at her for a moment. She did not speak. She turned and left. It was, Vel'Shaan thought, the most honest scientific communication he had witnessed in a long time. An acknowledgement without the architecture of an apology, which was harder to give and more respectful to receive. Constance picked up the report, read the first page, and smiled at it the way she had probably smiled at students who had finally, after a long time, understood something. Not triumph, just the satisfaction of recognition happening in the right direction. Vel'Shaan, watching from across the room, felt his circulatory lines warm and darken beneath his integument, visible, pronounced. Something his body was doing without his permission, and that he found, for the first time in recent memory, he had no desire to conceal. The map took him 4 more days. It was the most complex survey document he had produced in 31 years. Dual-layer geological model, revised atmospheric data, the full thermal vent network, calibration notes explaining the discrepancy between the original age estimate and the corrected one, and an additional section he had never included in a survey map before. A margin layer, labeled Observational Notes C. Okafor, containing every note he had made, transferred from his log with full attribution in the order she had made them. He wrote a methodological note to accompany the margin layer. He intended it to be brief, 3-4 sentences explaining what the section was and how it should be weighted by future surveyors. He rewrote it 7 times. The problem was that every attempt either understated what she had done or overstated it in a way that made it sound like a curiosity rather than a contribution, and neither was acceptable. On the 8th attempt, he simply described, as precisely as he could, what had happened. An observer without instruments, applying a method trained by 30 years of embodied pedagogy, had identified 4 anomalies in 16 days that instrument survey had failed to detect, all of which proved consequential to the geological and atmospheric model of the subject world. He recommended that future surveys of geologically young terrestrial worlds consider embedding observers with equivalent experiential backgrounds. He did not have a name for this methodology. He left a space where a name could go. He read the note back to himself when it was finished. It was, he realized, also a description of what he had done wrong for 31 years. Not with the instruments. The instruments were excellent. With the assumption that the instruments were the entirety of the method, that sensitivity and precision and a functionally 0 error margin meant the picture was complete. The instruments had never been wrong. He had simply sometimes been asking them the wrong questions. He submitted the map as a co-authored document listing Constance as co-contributor. He listed the survey correctly as a 2-methodology expedition. He submitted it to the core archive with his standard certification and sat back and looked at the completed file. He experienced the cold flush. Of course he did. He had finished a map. But this one was the 13th time, and it was different from the 12 before it. The previous 12 had felt like completion, the satisfying finality of uncertainty resolved, blank space filled, all the unknowing replaced by clean lines and verified coordinates. This one felt like an opening. The margin was part of the map. The margin was, in some ways, the most important part of the map. And it could be added to. It was not finished in the way a map had always been finished. He wasn't sure he would ever feel the same way about a completed map again. He found this, to his own surprise, more exciting than alarming. The last morning on Verath 7 came in quiet gray and amber, the atmosphere thin enough that the colors arrived early, before the light had fully committed to being day. Vel'Shaan found Constance outside at dawn, standing at the edge of the landing site with her camera, photographing the horizon. He stood beside her. She showed him the photographs on the small screen of the camera. Not the geological formations, not the vent sites, not the landmarks that had made it into the official survey record. Just the edges, the places where one thing became another. Rock into sky, shadow into light. The solid surface of a world meeting the uncertain air above it. Boundaries, thresholds. the places the planet was still deciding what it was.
"This is what I was really mapping," she said.
He asked if he could see. She handed him the camera without hesitation. He looked through the photographs for a long time. They were not scientific documents. They were not data in any form he knew how to categorize. They were a record of someone paying attention to the parts that didn't fit neatly into the picture. The edges, the in-between places, the moments of transition that instruments passed through on the way to measuring something else. They were a kind of cartography he had no formal name for, and had apparently been doing, in a small way, in his own margin notes for the past 3 days. He handed the camera back. He said, "I would like to learn how to do that." She looked at him for a moment, and her expression held something that was not triumph and not surprise, and not the particular warmth of a person who has been vindicated. It was quieter than all of those things. It was the expression of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time and was glad the attention had eventually been mutual. She said, "You already started. I read your margin notes from week 2. He had not known she had read them. He stood with this information for a moment, understanding that the margin he had thought was private, the tentative observations, the quality of light in the third valley, the sound like a question in the wind, had been visible to someone all along, and that the someone had recognized them for what they were before he had. He found he was glad, not embarrassed, not exposed, glad. His body offered no stress response, no flicker, no hum, no inverted breath, no extended fingers reaching for something to grip. He was simply standing on the surface of a planet that had been hiding its true nature for 16 days, in the company of a person who had been reading him the same way she read landscapes, and he was still and present and undefended, and that was fine. He did not know exactly what he was feeling. He had a large vocabulary in 2 languages for the states of precision and certainty and completion that had defined his career. He did not have a word for this. He made a note of that, not in any log, just to himself. He would find the word, or he would make one. He was, after all, learning to be comfortable with the things he couldn't yet name. Back aboard the vessel, while the departure checks ran and Yis submitted the final instrument logs, and Perrine sat quietly reviewing the revised atmospheric data with the focused expression of someone reorganizing their understanding of their own field, Vel'Shaan sat at his workstation and opened the file for the next expedition. Routine survey, standard instrumentation. A terrestrial world cataloged by automated probe and considered straightforward. He looked at the expedition parameters for a moment. Then he opened the margin. It was empty. He left it open. He did not yet know what would go there. He was no longer certain that was a problem.